Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be sharing my ultimate guide to fantasy romance. Alright guys, so I'm sure many of you have noticed that fantasy romance is becoming more and more popular. So I wanted to create this guide just to discuss the different subcategories in fantasy romance. So I know many of us know the very popular fantasy romance books like ACOTAR, Fourth Wing, From Blood and Ash. So I kind of wanted to talk about some of the more lesser known subcategories in fantasy romance and then give you book recommendations for each subcategory. I hope that made sense. But in this video, I will be discussing over 25 fantasy romance books, so hopefully you guys can get a good recommendation. Now, I also have a fantasy romance guide that is based on spice level. So if you're looking for a certain book or a certain level of spiciness in your fantasy romance, definitely check out that video. I will have it linked in the cards and the description. I would also like to point out I have laryngitis. I don't normally sound like this. It's been going on for a month, driving me crazy. So I know my voice is a little off, but I promise I feel fine. My voice just is not cooperating with me. But anyway, if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Wednesday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram, Goodreads, and Patreon, all linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about all of these fantasy romance books. Alright guys, so starting off with YA fantasy romance or young adult fantasy romance. Now if you're unfamiliar with young adult fantasy romance, these books are typically intended for a younger audience. I think it says online between 12 and 18. Now I still read YA as an adult, however I've noticed recently I feel like I might be a little too old for that genre. I'm just not enjoying those books as much as I used to. Now also with these books, since they are intended for a younger audience, normally there is not as much mature content, not as much graphic violence, and they're just meant for a younger audience. So there are two series that I love that are YA fantasy that I want to talk about. So first up, we have Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. I adore the first two books in this series. So this is following Evangeline Fox, and she is a girl that lives in a world where it is known that you do not make deals with fates. Now, Evangeline's best friend is about to marry her stepsister, and she does not want this wedding to happen. So she runs to the nearest fate, who happens to be Jax, the Prince of Broken Hearts, and begs for him to stop this wedding. Now, Jax agrees on the condition that Evangeline will give him 3 kisses from the men of his choosing, and the story goes from there. So this series literally feels like walking into a fairy tale. It is very whimsical, and it's just such an enjoyable read. Now, like I said, I love book 1. Book 2 is probably my favorite YA fantasy ever written. And then book 3 was the ultimate letdown for me. You guys might enjoy it, so just know that going in. Now, the other series that I feel like I have to touch on is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. Now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this in the YA section, just because towards the end of this series, it does feel a lot more new adult, but it did start out as YA. I believe Sarah J. Maas was like 16 when she wrote the series, and it is amazing. It is such a good fantasy series. Highly recommend if you have not picked this up yet. It does not have the amount of spice as ACOTAR and Crescent City, but still such a good read. So it is very hard to talk about the series without giving spoilers, but we are following Selena Sardathian, and she is this assassin who ends up traveling to this kingdom where she is forced to compete in these gladiator-like trials, and there's a mystery she has to uncover. And if you're interested in reading the series, I am currently hosting a read-along along with my Patreons, so you can check that out. I have my Patreon link down in the description below, but we are up to Heir of Fire when I'm filming this, and that is one of my favorite books in the series. So I hope you guys can join us, but these are two absolutely amazing YA fantasy series. Alright, and next up we have the super hyped or super popular fantasy romances. Now, these are the fantasy romances that got a lot of people interested in the fantasy romance genre, so I actually believe they are a great place to start. One of the books I'm going to talk about is how I discovered fantasy romance. Now, all of these books are mature adult fantasy romance books, so they do have spice, they do have some mature themes. However, I don't really believe any of them are overly spicy. I do have a really spicy fantasy romance category that I'll talk about at the end of this video. But anyway, let's talk about these 3 series. So starting off, I obviously cannot make a fantasy romance guide without including A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This is the book that got so many people to fall in love with the fantasy romance genre. I feel like this is a great beginner series. Now, a lot of people say that Tog is the better beginner series, but if you're looking for a series that has a little bit more romance, ACOTAR is a great place to start. It is where I started with Sarah J. Maas, and I don't regret it. I also feel like this does a very good job of making it easy to understand the fantasy world. Some of the books I'm going to talk about later in this video have very complex magic systems or a lot of world building, and while this does have a very immersive world, it's a very easy read, very digestible. So, if you're unfamiliar with the plot of A Court of Thorns and Roses, we are following Farah. And Farah is this human girl that lives on the border of the Fae lands. Now, Farah's family is very poor, so one day she is out hunting and accidentally kills a Fae, mistaking it for a wolf. So because of this, she is then forced to leave her family, go to the Fae lands, and live with the High Lord of the Spring Court. And the story goes from there. Once again, this is one of my favorite series ever written. It is just so unbelievably good. So I highly recommend, if you are new to fantasy romance, check this book out. And next up, we have Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Everybody was talking about this book when it first released, mostly because of these gorgeous sprayed edges. But honestly, I loved this book. I really love dragons in my fantasy romance. This has dragons and trials, two of my favorite things. But if you are new to fantasy romance, I feel like the writing in this is also very easy to read, and it's just a very fun, fast-paced story. So if you're unfamiliar with Fourth Wing, we are following Violet Sorrengail, and she was born believing that she was going to become a scribe, and instead, when she comes of age, her mother tells her that she's actually going to become a dragon rider, despite the fact that Violet has a condition where her bones and her ligaments are easily breakable and damaged. She is going to have to compete against other cadets and eventually learn to ride a dragon and hopefully stay alive long enough to gain magical abilities. And the story goes from there. Now, this also has a political feel to it. There is a war that is slowly kind of like creeping up on the quadrant, and I just really, really enjoyed the story. So highly recommend. I think it is worth all of the hype. And last up, we have From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Now, fun fact, my first video on BookTube was actually a review of From Blood and Ash, so if you want to check that out, I'll leave it down in the description. It's very cringy. It's 4 years old. I didn't know what I was doing, but I love this series. This is one of the only series. I don't typically read books physically. I'm an audiobook lover, but I actually sat and read the first 3 books physically because there was no audiobook available, and I just love this series. However, I will say I do believe the series is getting a little bit dragged out, especially because now there's a prequel series. So I'm hoping J-Law kind of finishes the series up and it ends with like an amazing conclusion, because I feel like we're dragging out these characters. But if you're unfamiliar with From Blood and Ash, it is the spiciest out of the 3 books I talked about in this category, and we are following Poppy. Now, Poppy is a human, and she was known as the Maiden. So she's been raised in isolation, and she's getting ready for her ascension, and we don't exactly know what that means. We just know it's a ritual. But like I said, raised in isolation, so she's not allowed to talk to anybody except for 2 members of her personal guard and a few of the like noble people in this society. Now anyway, one day, Poppy decides she wants to go out, have a good time, so she wears a disguise and goes to the Red Pearl, which is a bar, and when she gets there, she ends up meeting Hawk, who is the newest member of the Rise Guard, and they have this very intimate moment, and then Hawk ends up being put as one of Poppy's personal guards, and it is their romance. So this actually kind of skirts the line of fantasy romance and paranormal romance. We have werewolves, we have vampires, and there's so much action, and the angst in this first book is so, so good. Not this first book, but in the first book. So highly recommend. I will also say, if you pick up this series, please read the books in publication order, starting with From Blood and Ash, and then working your way until the prequel series released, and then read the books in publication order. If that didn't make any sense, I'll kind of explain it down in the description, but I get a lot of DMs asking how to read this series, and it is a little bit confusing. Just know, publication order is key. But those are 3 very popular fantasy romance series that deserve all of the hype. And the next category is dark fantasy romance, and it's exactly what the name sounds like. So it's fantasy romance that has darker subject matter, so make sure to check trigger warnings. Very similar to dark romance, it just has more fantastical elements, so it's considered fantasy. Now, I am fairly new to this genre. I just discovered it towards the end of last year, so I haven't read very many, but there are two dark romances, or dark fantasy romances, that I am very excited to talk about. So first up, we have Feathers So Vicious, and this is the first book in a dark fantasy romance duology by Liv Zander. Now, Liv Zander has another dark romance duology that is way too dark for me. You can Google that if you want to check it out. But this book was actually recommended by one of you guys. There was a comment left on my last video saying, have you read this? It's one of my favorite dark fantasy romances. I read this book that day. So thank you guys so much. I love when you recommend me books. But anyway, this book is wild. So it is a dark fantasy romance. We are following this girl that lives in a world where there are humans and then there are ravens. Ravens are kind of like a dark type of magical being that look human, but then they're able to turn into ravens. And it's very hard to tell who is a raven unless they happen to shift in front of you. So anyway, our main character ends up being kidnapped by two very high-powered ravens, and they want to use her as a hostage to get back someone the humans have stolen from them. And I'm not exactly sure if this is wide shoes or a love triangle, because I only read the first book in this duology, but either way, it is super angsty, super dark, and was a really fun read. So I'll definitely be picking up the sequel. And next up, we have How Does It Feel? Now, I somehow missed the fact that this book went viral on TikTok because there are some very unhinged things that happen in this book. I just happened to see it at Barnes & Noble, and I bought it on a whim. I'm very happy I did, because I did enjoy this book. However, this will not be for everybody, so check trigger warnings. But this is following this woman who, when she was younger, she believed she saw a fairy. So she's kind of been obsessed with winged creatures ever since. So she is trying to find these lunar moths, which are an endangered species of moth, and she knows they like a certain type of mushroom. So she moves to the place where this mushroom is grown, and while searching for these moths, she ends up in a portal that takes her to the Unseelie Court, where she meets the prince of the Unseelie Court, and he is evil. I'm not talking morally gray, like he is all super, super evil throughout most of this book. So the story goes from there. There's a very interesting tree monster that's into some weird stuff. So, like I said, check trigger warnings, but the ending of this book shook me. I have never been so caught off guard by an ending, so I cannot wait to read the sequel to this book, but this is another dark fantasy romance that I definitely think is worth picking up. And next up, we have urban fantasy romance. So this is fantasy romance that is typically set in modern day, normally in a city, and these characters have more tech. So unlike ACOTAR or like high fantasy, this is set kind of like in the modern day for the most part. Now, I gotta be honest, urban fantasy is normally not my thing. However, there are two books that I really enjoyed, or two series I really enjoyed that are urban fantasy. So first up, we have Zodiac Academy by Carolyn Beckman and Susan Valenti. So this is, I believe, going to be a 9-book series, and this follows the Vega twins. So the Vega twins are these two girls that are living a pretty terrible life. They really only have each other, and on their 18th birthday, they find out that they are actually Fae royalty. However, in order to gain their inheritance, they have to go to the Zodiac Academy. And when they get there, they find out that there are already these celestial heirs that are ruling the school. So the first book is very much a bully romance. These girls are trying to prove themselves against these 4 guys that are trying to make their lives absolutely horrible. And then a romance begins. So I love this series, but it does have its issues. I will say the writing in the series is probably the worst out of all the books I'm about to talk about. However, the first few books are so addicting. You're gonna have your favorite characters. There's so much humor, and they're just such fun reads. Now, I will also say, unfortunately, the last few books that have released, I haven't been a huge fan of. I just feel like we are stretching the series out way longer than it needs to go. So I'm hoping this 9th book is actually the last book, and then the authors don't surprise us with 2 more editions or something like that. But overall, like I said, there are characters in this series that just live rent-free in my mind and are some of my absolute favorites. If you're looking for dragon shifters, vampires, and just all of these amazing creatures, highly recommend the Zodiac Academy. And probably the most popular urban fantasy series is Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas. So this is Crescent City, House of Earth and Blood. This is the first book in the series, and I will say this first book packs an emotional punch. I've probably cried the most reading this book than any other book by SJM. Now, I will say this series as a whole is my least favorite, but like I said before, I don't love urban fantasy, so that is probably why. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the plot of Crescent City, we are following Bryce Quinlan, and she is a half-fae, half-human living in Lunathian. So Lunathian is this city, and humans are kind of looked down upon. So Bryce is best friends with Danica, who is a shifter and the leader of the Pack of Devils, which is kind of like this vigilante werewolf group. And then Juniper, who's a faun and also a dancer. And then Fury Axstar, who is an assassin. So one day, Bryce ends up going out with some of her friends, has a great night. When she comes home, she finds out that a murder has taken place. So Bryce, along with a fallen angel named Hunt Athalar, have to solve this murder. And the story goes from there. So overall, like I said, my least favorite series by SJM, but still a very fun read, and I highly recommend. Okay, so this next subgenre doesn't really have a name, but it's fantasy romance with more mature or older characters. I get so many DMs asking me for fantasy romance recs that have characters that are either in their 30s or just a little bit more mature, since typically fantasy romance is new adult and we're following characters that are around the age of 18. So I have 2 books I'm very excited to talk about. They are 2 of my favorites. I gave both of them 5 stars. And if you are looking for mature characters, I got you covered. So first up we have Between Wrath and Mercy, and this is by Jess Weisskopf. So this is following Emmeline, and she is a woman that is trapped in a loveless marriage, and the only light in her life is her daughter. That is until her daughter is kidnapped. So Emmeline realizes that she has to make a deal with the bloody Prince Rainier, who she has a pass with, in order to find and get her daughter back, and the story goes from there. I loved this book mostly because the characters are, like I said, a little bit older. They're in their 30s, so I related to them so much more. They weren't quite as impulsive as the typical characters that you follow in fantasy romance that are like 18 and 19. These characters really use critical thinking skills, and they weren't running into battles that they know they could lose. So I really enjoyed this. It also is a lot spicier than I was expecting towards the second half of the book. So know that. I feel like not a lot of people talk about that, but this book is steamy. But overall, I love this, and I still need to read the sequel. And next up is Entreat Me by Grace Draven. So this is actually Beauty and the Beast reimagining. And while there is a younger couple that we are following, there's also an older couple. So this is actually like a double romance. So we are following a father and son who have both been cursed, and they live in this sentient castle where they are slowly turning into beasts. And the only way to break this curse is to find true love, much like the original tale. So the son ends up going out and he finds this girl that he brings back to the castle. Now, what he doesn't realize is this girl's older sister follows them. So now all 4 of them are trapped in this castle trying to break this curse, and it goes from there. And I just love this so much. Grace Draven is one of my absolute favorite fantasy romance authors, so highly recommend. If you have not read any books by her, you need to pick her up. So next up is Cozy Fantasy Romance. Now, these books are more like feel-good fantasy romance, kind of like the opposite of dark fantasy romance. You're not going to find really dark subplots or anything like that. These are just books that you can sit down with a cup of tea and just feel warm and cozy while you read them. Now, with that being said, I don't read a lot of cozy fantasy romance. I like more of the action-packed, darker stuff. So I only have 1 recommendation, but I will talk about 2 other very popular fantasy romances that are super cozy. So 2 cozy fantasy romances I've been seeing everywhere are Emily Wilde's The Encyclopedia of Fairies. So I unfortunately have not picked this up yet, but I've heard this is very like cottagecore, cozy fantasy romance. So that is probably a really good place to start. Also, Legends and Lattes, which I believe is like a monster fantasy romance that takes place in a coffee shop. I know a lot of my friends have really enjoyed it. My friend Hannah Blackwell actually has a, I believe, fantasy romance or cozy fantasy romance or cottagecore fantasy romance rec video. So if I can find that, I'll put that down in the description below as well. Check out her channel. She does cozy. I do not. The only cozy book I could think of that I've read is House in the Cerulean Sea, which is one of my absolute favorite fantasy romances by T.J. Klune. I feel like if you work in social work or in education, you need to read this fantasy romance. So we're following this guy that is essentially a social worker, but like a magical social worker. And his higher-ups tell him he has to go to this foster home, but the kids are all very dangerous. So we have like a sprite, we have Lucifer as a child, and all of these very dangerous children. And they are being looked over by Arthur Panassus, who is like this very almost Dumbledore-esque type character, and it's a romance between, it's an MM romance, and it's between the social worker and Arthur Panassus, but also it is just such a feel-good, but also emotional fantasy romance that I just really enjoy and I always try to recommend. I feel like I haven't talked about it in a while, but it is one of my favorite fantasy romances, so definitely check it out if you just want a feel-good story. And next up we have vampire fantasy romance. Now I wasn't sure if I wanted to have this category just because vampire is more paranormal. However, these books are marketed as fantasy romance that feature vampires. So I wanted to talk about them. And obviously, like the name suggests, they are fantasy romance books that feature some form of vampire. Now they're not always called vampires. From Blood and Ash, I would consider a vampire fantasy romance. However, the characters are not ever referred to as vampires. They're referred to as a different being, but they suck blood and have a lot of those like vampiric traits. So I have 3 books I want to talk about. So starting off, we have King of Battle and Blood by Scarlett St. Clair. Now this book is very spicy. Most of Scarlett St. Clair's books are, so know that going in. But this is following Isolde, and she is about to marry the king of the vampires in order to stop a 100-year war that has been raging against her people and the king of the vampires, who has been killing people and then turning them into undead soldiers. So her plan is to marry, I believe his name's Adrian, and then kill him and return back to her people, but things do not go as planned, and the story goes from there. So I will say, although I did enjoy this first book, I prefer a fantasy romance that has a more of a slow burn, a build-up to the romance, and unfortunately, this book kind of starts with spice right off the bat. So I didn't love it as much as I wanted to. However, I read this book physically, and I definitely want to check out the audiobook because I feel like I might enjoy it a little bit more. But overall, this is a very solid fantasy romance. And next up we have Slaying the Vampire Conqueror by Carissa Broadbent. Now, I want to preface this by saying Carissa Broadbent has so many amazing fantasy romances that feature vampires. Six Scorched Roses is a novella I'm going to talk about later, my favorite novella of all time. And then Serpent, the Wings of Night, and Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, which is the Crown of Nyaxia duology, is absolutely amazing, but I feel like I don't hear enough people talking about Slaying the Vampire Conqueror. So this is following a girl that essentially joined a cult when she was younger to this group of people that worship the goddess. So she ends up becoming a seer, which is where she gives up her eyesight in order to be able to see the threads of fate. So she doesn't have eyes, but instead she is able to see the different threads, and that's how she kind of goes through life. And I thought that was a very unique and interesting concept. But anyway, this cult wants her to become the seer for a vampire conqueror who has been conquering all of these lands, and the cult wants to see this vampire dead. So she ends up being able to infiltrate his camp, and the story goes from there, and I loved it so much. So if you're looking for a very unique fantasy romance that features a vampire, check this book out. All right, so this next category also doesn't really have a name, but it is fantasy romances that have more plot than spice. They have more complex magic systems and just a lot more world building in general. So this is more for the person that is coming from fantasy or has a fantasy background or like historical fiction and wants to try out fantasy romance. So while there is a romance, there's also a lot more going on in these stories. So first up we have Daughter of No Worlds by Chris Broadbent. So this book is following Tasana, and when she was very young, she was sold into slavery, and she is forced to perform performative magic. Now she believes she can buy her freedom, however, when she goes to do that, she ends up being attacked. So she is able to flee to this government-like order, and she asks that they help her free her people. Now they refuse, but they say if she learns how to fight and becomes a member of their order, they might help her. So she ends up training under this guy who I can only describe as like General Mustang from Full Metal Alchemist, and it's their romance. But besides their romance, there is also this war weapon that is horrifying, that is also kind of at the focal point of this story. There's also a war that is brewing, and there is just so much more going on other than their romance, which is also, I really enjoyed. So I haven't finished this series. I read the first 2 books. I am hoping to finish it this year, but if you are looking for a book that has a very immersive and more complex world, check out Daughter of No Worlds. And if you're looking for a fantasy romance that has amazing world building, and you can just tell the author did so much research, it feels like an historical fiction just with magic, we have Anastasia by Sophie Lark, which is insane because I love Sophie Lark's mafia romances, but had she written this under a pen name, I never would have guessed this was by Sophie Lark. Now, I love both types of her books for different reasons. I love those mafia romance books, like they were amazing, but this book was just so well researched. It was just so good. So if you're a fan of the original Anastasia cartoon, you need to read this. We're following, obviously, Anastasia, and her father is he's the Tsar of Russia, but he also is one of the most powerful magically, and he has a time travel ability, and Anastasia also possesses this ability, so she ends up training with her father, but also with Rasputin. And if you know anything about the original Anastasia tale, you know Rasputin is bad news. And the story kind of goes from there, but there is a romance, and I really enjoyed the romance in this book, but just, it felt like reading a historical fiction book in the best possible way. So I don't hear enough people talking about this book, so highly recommend. Definitely try this book out. I loved it. And next up we have one of my favorite types of fantasy romances, slow burn fantasy romance. So all this means is that the romance takes a while, it really develops, there's more of an emotional impact, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the book has to be super long. One of the books I'm going to talk about is actually a novella, so it's really short, but still had that slow burn feel where you just want these two characters to kiss already, but also they've already developed such an amazing connection, and yes, I love slow burn fantasy romances. So first up we have Six Scorched Roses by Chris Broadbent. So this is set in the same world as the Crown of Nyaxia series, and we are following this girl who has been cursed. So she knows that she is going to die at a very young age, and on top of that, her entire community has been cursed to slowly wither away into dust. So before our main character dies, she wants to break the curse on her people. Now she is still going to die because her curse or disease is kind of different, but she doesn't want to watch her family waste away. So she believes the cure to this curse can be found with vampire blood, and lucky enough, a vampire has just moved into her area. So she approaches this vampire and says, I will give you magical roses in exchange for vials of your blood, and the story goes from there, and I love it so much. This is also a vampire fantasy romance, and I couldn't believe how slow burn the romance felt with such a short book. Like, I was screaming for these two characters to just make out and love each other, and it was taking forever. So I love this novella. It is my favorite of all time. And next up is my favorite fantasy series of 2024. I do not see any fantasy romance series beating this series for me. It is so good. And that is Spark of the Everflame. This is the second book, Glow of the Everflame. I still have not read Heat of the Everflame because there is no audiobook out, but as soon as that audiobook drops, I am reading it. This is the most slow burn fantasy romance, but in the best way. So this is following Diem, and Diem is a human that is living in a world where there are humans and then there are descended. Now the descended are descended from gods, so they have these godlike abilities, and that is how they're able to rule the humans. However, some of the humans are getting kind of sick of the way the descended are treating them, so they have created this rebel group, and our main character Diem's boyfriend is part of this rebel group. Now, Diem's mother is a healer, and because of this, she is able to go into the community of the Descended, which most people are not. And Diem is also training to be a healer, which gives her that privilege. Then Diem's mother goes missing, and Diem has to figure out what side of this war she is on. And the story goes from there, and it is so, so good. And if you read any book in this video, please pick up Spark of the Everflame. Like I said, the second book, Glow of the Everflame, is actually my favorite, but you need Spark for that introduction. But this has the slowest of slow burns, and I just absolutely love it. And the last category is super spicy fantasy romance. Now, I was going to say that these books have more spice than plot, but that is not necessarily the case. Two of these books I actually really enjoy the overall story. They just have a lot of very, very spicy scenes. And I personally love reading those types of books. I know they're not for everybody, but I wanted to talk about some of the spiciest fantasy romances that I've read. So first off, we have A Court of Silver Flames, and this is the reason why I didn't want to say these books have more smut than plot, because while this book is super, super spicy, like SJM really popped off with this one compared to all of her other books, it does have a beautiful story about a character healing after a very traumatic event, and also a romance, and just almost like self-improvement. It was just such a good story. Now, I can't really tell you very much about this besides that, just because it is a spoiler for ACOTAR if you haven't read ACOTAR. But overall, this book, I don't love this character, but overall this was a very solid read and unbelievably spicy. Really quick fun story. I read this and I wasn't expecting it to be as spicy as it was. And I live in Jersey where we don't pump our own gas. We're not allowed, like literally we're not allowed to do it. I don't know how. My husband always does it if we go out of state. So anyway, I was listening to the audiobook of this and I got gas and there was the spiciest scene that started playing and I could not get to the volume controls fast enough. And it was so embarrassing and I've never gone back to the gas station. But anyway, this is a book that has probably an equal amount, not even. It has more plot than smut, but still, it is so, so spicy. All right, guys, my voice is officially almost gone, so bear with me. But next up, we have A Kingdom of Stars and Shadows, which I really enjoyed the story. However, I must say the entire second half of this book just devolves into straight spice, and it doesn't really advance the plot in any way, which is why I have not finished this series. But the story is actually really good. It's following this girl that was born with a mark that designates her for having very powerful blood if it is consumed by the Fae. So her mother promises at her birth that she will marry the Prince of a Fae in order to kind of like power him up. So our main character does not want to do this, and when she comes of age, she is forced to go to the Fae lands where she meets her soon-to-be husband, and she is not impressed. However, she also meets his brother, and that is a different story. So it's a little bit of a love triangle, but overall, I really love the story. I just wish the second half wasn't quite so spicy. And last up is a book that I have not read in 4 years. However, this book kind of scarred me because I had just read a bunch of like high fantasy. I think I was in like a Brandon Sanderson phase. And then I picked this book up and wow, was there a difference? So this is Flames of Chaos by Amelia Hutchins. I do plan on rereading this in May to see if I'm still so like shocked by it. But this is following a witch who I believe she's in this coven, and then one of the witches in this coven end up going missing. So they end up traveling to this like paranormal world in order to find her. And when they get there, they meet this warlock who's like really into spicy stuff, and I'm pretty sure there's spice like right off the bat. So I ended up DNFing this book. I only got like 9 chapters in, and I was like, whoa, way too spicy for me. But it was also at a time I wasn't reading a lot of romance. But still, this is one of the spiciest fantasy romances I've ever read. All right, guys, that is it for my ultimate guide to fantasy romance. I would really love to make a part 2 to this video, just because there are some subgenres I wasn't able to cover because my voice has given up. But let me know down in the comments if there are any other subgenres of fantasy romance you guys would love recs for. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to my Paladin protectors, Amanda, Erin, and Leslie. Thank you guys so much for watching and supporting my channel. And I said this already, I post new videos on Wednesday and Sunday. And if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye.